live streaming. Okay, very hipster.
Very professional. Miguel knows what he's doing.
Evidently, we're very cool.
Good evening, or good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. Welcome to Abralim Online. We hope you are safe and healthy. My name is Janaína Weissheimer, and I work at Universidade Federal do Rio Grande do
Very
Norte.
hipster.
In Natal. Miguel knows you.
Evidently, we're very cool.
And I've been given the privilege of introducing today's speaker. Wherever you are, welcome to Abralim Online. We hope you are safe and healthy. My name is Janaína Weissheimer, and I work at Universidade Federal do Rio Grande do
Very
Norte.
hipster.
In Natal. Miguel knows you.
Evidently, we're very cool.
Okay, and I've been given the privilege and the honor of introducing today's speaker.
Welcome to
David Poeppel, or David Poeppel, as he's also known outside Germany. But first, let me remind you that Linguists Online is organized by the Brazilian Linguistics Association, Abralim, in cooperation with the Permanent International Committee of Linguists, the Latin American Association of Linguistics and Philology, the Argentinian Society of Language Studies, the Linguistic Society of America, the European Linguistic Society, the Linguistics Association of Great Britain, and the Australian Linguistic Society. So David Poeppel is the director of the Department of Neuroscience at the Max-Planck-Institute in Frankfurt and professor of psychology and neuroscience at NYU. He also directs the Center for Language, Music, and Emotion. How cool is that? He's been trained at MIT in cognitive science, linguistics, and neuroscience, and he did his postdoctoral training at the University of California in San Francisco. So the title of today's talk is Rhythms of Speech and Rhythms of Brains. So Dr. Poeppel's research reveals that the temporal structure of speech and music and the temporal organization of various brain structures align in systematic ways. Dr. Poeppel will describe some intuitively simple but surprising results that illuminate the temporal structure of our linguistic experience. From recognizing speech to building abstract grammatical structures, how the brain constructs and represents time reveals unexpected puzzles about language. David, it's a great pleasure for us to have you here tonight. Thank you for doing this, and I hope everybody has a great time.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Miguel. Thank you very much, Jana, for inviting me. Hopeful that audio things work, that video things work in our new format of giving lectures to each other. I don't know where anyone is sitting. I'm sitting in Connecticut, a little bit north of New York, about 100 miles north of New York in this very strange time. Let me share my screen now so I can begin my lecture, and you guys can give me a signal if it's working. Okay. Can you see my screen? Jana, can you see my screen? Okay, terrific. So I want to talk about things near and dear to my heart, but I hope a topic that concerns, in some sense, all of us, because we care about language, listen to language, use language, and in particular, many different languages. But before I talk about the research from my team, maybe a little reminder of what's going on. I mean, here's a picture of our little planet, our home, and things are in dire straits right now. We have, on the one hand, the situation that's putting us all onto a Zoom lecture, the pandemic, but there are also larger issues like climate change, which we can't escape. So our little nice planet is in trouble. And although we want to have fun talking about our work and enjoy it and celebrate what we do, I think it's worth remembering that we have other responsibilities as well. And so one of the scientists we often turn to for good quotes is Albert Einstein, who has an important quote in that context, which is, "The world is a dangerous place, not because of those who do evil, but because of those who look on and do nothing." And when I read that, it makes me feel a little guilty myself, because it's very clear that I know I'm not doing enough, and we all have to do our part. And in fact, the very first person in this lecture series was Noam Chomsky, who famously wrote an essay called "It's the Responsibility of Intellectuals to Speak Truth and Expose Lies." And since we are trained to collect data, evaluate data, think about data in a critical way, I think it's incumbent on us to take seriously what our planet is going through and to contribute in a positive way. And I don't know, I have no recipe, and I know I'm not very good at it, but I know I have to do a better job, and so do we probably all. So with that serious and not very lighthearted note, for context, let me tell you about things that I've been thinking about speech, which is an endlessly fascinating and weird signal. So while you're sitting there, what you're hearing is some signal that's coming to your ear, and that signal looks like that waveform on top. I'm going to move my mouse around. Do you see the mouse moving actually as a little test case? Jana, do you see? Wonderful. Okay, so this is a waveform, and this is actually the signal that gets to your ear. So it actually is a mechanical vibration that gets to your ear. Now, as you're listening to me, what you're seemingly hearing are words. As you don't hear some string of sound, you just hear one word after the other and you put them together. But that's actually very remarkable and a very significant feat, because there are actually no little breaks in running speech the way I'm talking. That's because we don't speak like this, because we don't take weird breaks in the middle of our speech. It's just a continuous flow of information. And the problem of segmenting speech for a brain or a listener is sort of like trying to read this. So try to read this piece of text at the bottom. And this is very annoying. It's annoying because it's missing the little white spaces that tell you where the boundaries are. That's what makes reading in some sense easier. That is, the problem of segmentation is actually solved for you before you even try. But segmenting speech is a tricky business. And one of the things I'm going to try to convince you of is that there's a pretty simple mechanism that helps us. And it's a mechanism that we've come to understand from research at the intersection of aspects of speech, aspects of linguistics, and aspects of the brain. So the answer I'm going to give you in a little while is about how this process works. And you can remind yourself how difficult it is if you're listening to a language you don't understand. So if you don't speak the language and you hear running speech, two people having a conversation, it's extraordinarily difficult to figure out what's going on because you don't have the words. Likewise, for infants, pre-linguistic infants, it's a steady stream of sounds without structure that has to be actually extracted. So it's a deep and serious problem in psychology of language. Now, to make it a little bit more clear where this is going to go, here's a simple example of a speech signal, namely the sentence, "Baby, you can drive my car," made famous in a good song. On top, again, the waveform, that's what gets to your ear. And in the middle is what we call a spectrogram. Most of you are familiar with that. That has time on the x-axis and frequency on the y-axis. And it's a kind of representation that's similar to what the brain does at the initial stages. That is, it takes speech and decomposes it into lots of little parts. So at the top is what you get in the ear. In the middle is the kind of thing you get in parts of the brain. Now in the bottom, you see the same thing as you see on top, but with this outline, this orange line around the signal, that is what we call the envelope. This is the envelope around the speech signal. And underneath you see little arrows. And when you start looking at that, you say, huh, that's kind of regular. there's some kind of structure to this in the time when you look at this envelope. And it turns out, I'm going to show you in a second, when you look at speech from that point of view, that is from the perspective of what comes to the ear, you learn interesting things about what's going on in our heads from the perspective of comprehending language. So the message is going to be that speech, a little bit surprisingly, is quasi-rhythmic, and that's true for any language. Okay. Well, what about other signals? It's not that surprising. I'm going to have to convince you that that's true, of course, and show you what I mean when I say speech is rhythmic. What about other signals? Let's see if you can hear this. So the segmentation problem is true for other auditory signals. Listen to this nice piece of music. I hope it works out over the Zoom method. Not so straightforward. What's coming to the ear is a waveform, again, like this. And that's encoded in your brain in something that looks like that. And there are no obvious places that say, well, this is the rhythmic structure of the signal. But yet, you interpret music as rhythmic. So there's something about speech that's rhythmic. There's evidently lots about music that's rhythmic. And it turns out, so is your brain. The brain, and this has been an important insight of the last few decades, has rhythmic structure in its physiological properties. So just to give you a quick view into that, if you see in this graph on top, here every little, so this is again time on the x-axis, and every little dot is when you're recording the physiological signal from a brain cell. And what you can see is it's called spiking. There's a spike and then a break. Spike, break, spike, breaks. And when you line all that up, as in the bottom here, this is called the local field potential, you see something go up and down and up and down and up and down. So there's actually a rhythmic signal in your brain in terms of what the cells themselves are doing. What's going on there? The concept that holds that together is what are called neural oscillations. So neural oscillations are what you just saw, namely the up and down, the rhythmic up and down, waxing and waning of brain activity. The brain, as you can see in this nice cartoon, is an electrical device, right? So it's plugged in. And when you record from this electrical device, there's these oscillations at different kinds of rates. There's slower ones, like here, and faster ones. In fact, when you record from brains, from any animal, in particular from the human brain, what you get at the output is a combined signal that has all kinds of different properties, and it's a little bit complicated. But when you take it apart with current analytic methods, you see different frequencies that are kind of fundamental building blocks or kind of Lego blocks of physiological activity. So there's activity in what's called the delta band, very low modulations, low frequencies. And for instance, the theta band, kind of intermediate, we're going to hear more about that in a second, and then higher frequencies. So all these different activity patterns go up and down in the brain in its resting state, but also the stimuli. Now, what's very important about this discovery in neuroscience is that it allows us to speculate about certain interesting things. So first of all, what are these things for? I mean, if you record from a brain with with any kind of device that you have, and you see oscillations, these things go up and down and up and down, what is this supposed to be? Well, one thing could be that it keeps brain activity in a kind of bandwidth of homeostatic defensibility. That is, it keeps it in a good place in physiological terms. So it has a kind of homeostatic function. More provocative, you might say, well, maybe it actually carries or reflects certain computations that are carried by the brain. So maybe this up and down can actually be used or reflects underlying neural computation. That's the direction we're going to go in, unsurprisingly. Or it's totally epiphenomenal. So it's like what somebody called the exhaust fumes of cortical computation. I actually don't know who said that, but I think it's a great quote. So it's just, in German you say the Auspuff. stuff happens, and then at the out of the car comes the, the exhaust fume. Now, it's of kind of fundamental importance that these oscillations exist in all creatures. Now, if you take, so for instance here, so-called alpha oscillations, they happen, this is the brain going up and down 10 times a second, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It's just very fast activity, or medium fast activity. You see that in recordings from humans, from monkeys, from dogs, cats, bats, rabbits, mice, the whole. So there's something very fundamental about that building block. Something is the wiring diagram. So when you take a bunch of cells and you line them up, you wire them together, out comes a circuit that gives you activity at roughly this time scale, regardless of how big you are. So if you see in this plot down here, you can have very small brains like a mouse. You can have very big brains like a human, but the frequency and the properties of this brain activity are basically the same. So it's something very stable. Okay, so we have speech that has some kind of rhythmic properties, music that clearly has rhythmic properties, and now the brain that has rhythmic properties. So you're going to guess correctly, there must be some connection. Otherwise, you wouldn't be telling me about this. So let's go back to speech and go look at this a little bit more methodically. So here's our example sentence again. Baby, you can drive my car. And let's look again at the bottom, which is what's so-called envelope, right? So the gray line is the whole thing is the speech signal. And we're going to look at this big outline, the signal going up and down and up and down. Now, is there anything in there that's regular and systematic? This had not really been looked at so much before. In speech science, by and large, what we do is we look at representations like the one in the middle under B. There's the so-called spectrograms, or representations that tell you in very fine temporal and spectral detail where different pieces of information might be that you would like to decode. So where is the baby, you can. So here's the can drive my car, right? So you're trying to decode this information. But we didn't spend so much time on the ups and downs of energy. Can we get something out of that? So you might say, well, maybe there's some structure in it, but maybe not. I mean, some people speak slowly, some people speak quickly. Every sentence is a little bit different. Why should there be any structure? So it turns out if you look at it a bit more broadly, something kind of amazing appears. So here's examples of, for instance, Mandarin, English, and French on the top. And what we're going to do is a little bit of very simple quantification and try to calculate, if you look at these envelopes of the up and down of the signal, is there anything regular in it? And what you can do is you can calculate something called the modulation spectrum, which we will not bother ourselves with here, but you take the speech signal, you take it apart, and then you calculate what is the modulation, that is the rate of change, the up and downness of this envelope. So now you have two ideas. Envelope, you got to know that one, and modulation. Now we're going to take a look at some language and see if it's regular. Now your first response probably should be, there is no way it's regular, because there's, slow speaking people, fast speaking people, everything's a little bit different. And sometimes you're in an interview situation, sometimes you might be reading a book. What's really going on? Well, it turns out when you do this calculation that you get something surprisingly regular. Here is what's called the modulation spectrum on top for different ways of speaking in English. So one is just audiobooks, right? So this is just somebody reading for many hours. So this is a huge database. This is not a few sentences. This is hours and hours and hours of speech material. So audiobooks, okay. Interviews, having a chit chat and interview, very much the same. Conversations, the same. And in fact, when you look at the frequency of the rate of speech, it's between 4 and 5 hertz, so 4 and 5 cycles per second. Now, of course, there's some distribution if you look at the thing on top, but it's pretty regular. It's surprisingly regular, in fact, not something one might necessarily expect. So there's something that if that is the mean rate of speech that's happening, your brain better be good at using that. Otherwise, you're in deep trouble. Now, you can object reasonably that, well, that's just English, and everyone's always studying English, and there's imperialism of English. So let's look at some other languages, because of course there's debates about things like stress timing, syllable timing. And if you look at a bunch of other languages, I must disappoint you. It comes out again the same. So here you see a bunch of other languages, from Norwegian to Swedish to some more English, Chinese, and so on. And you see this very stable distribution. So there's across languages a mean rate of speech that's just in the physical signal, granting that each individual sentence, of course, is going to be a little noisy. Something is very structured there. Now you can say, you can be reviewer number 3 and say, well, look, fine, you have a bunch of languages, but I don't like you guys, and I don't like your math. Let's try it a different way. And I say, okay, then you can go turn to some colleagues in Paris. In a nice paper by Leo Varnet from Christian Lorenzi's team, you can do a different kind of analysis, but you come up with the same numbers. Right? So here on the right side here are again the now familiar spectra. So you can calculate it a little bit differently, and very different languages now. Here you have Japanese, Marathi, Basque, Turkish, Zulu. So typologically very different languages. And the mean rate is very regularly, again, between 4 and 5 hertz. So now you should be a little bit more sympathetic, even though it feels like a kind of annoying intuition, because it violates our perverse enthusiasm for, let's say, diversity in all domains. Here, there's what seems to be a real universal chunk of knowledge. Now, to round this out, so here's summarizing this. So when the stuff that goes into the ear, which is a little bit more, broken up, has this very regular rate. And so this is the rate of speech as it comes into the ear. It's between 4 and 5 hertz. That's pretty, very regular. You can put that number in the bank. Here's the signal coming out of the mouth, which is why there's a mouth drawing here. Right? So this is a little bit shifted very closely to that for a bunch of other languages. And here, if you're an aficionado, you might say, well, how is it generated? So here's the sentence: before Thursday's exam, review every formula. Here's the envelope. How is it actually generated? Well, it's not that an individual articulator, like your lower lip or your tongue tip, is doing all the work. It's actually an amalgam, some function of all the different articulators together that end up generating what ends up being the very regular envelope, sentence by sentence. Okay, so that's just a fact of the physics of speech. And now I carried on a bit too long, but I think it's important to actually know this fact, because it's well, first of all, it's just interesting. It's kind of weird, right? That across all languages, there's a steady rate. It means there's something in the operating system that has both to do with the biomechanics of your face, jaw, and articulators, but of course the brain itself, namely it provides these rates. Now, this is for linguistic societies. And so your first response might be, why do I care? I mean, who gives a damn? And so what are these rates related to? Is there anything systematic? And it turns out that this rate is across languages systematically related to roughly the syllable size chunk. So what you get in this modulation is acoustic chunks that are approximately the duration of syllables across different languages. So that's just, so now you have the physics of speech, very regular, and it seems to align with something that is approximately a linguistic unit, although it's not a syllable, it's an acoustic chunk. So what should you remember up till now? The mean rate of speech across languages, expressed as the amplitude modulation rate, which is the signal going up and down, is between 4 and 5 hertz. And this corresponds to the natural biomechanical frequency of jaw movement of your articulators altogether. It also corresponds to the mean syllabic rate. Now, okay, quick excursion into a different domain. But there's other cool signals, because I gave you an example from speech, an example from music. What about music, just to close the parenthesis around that issue? You can do the same analysis for all kinds of musics, right? So you can take single voice instruments like cello, bass, viola, things that are with a more complicated voice like piano or guitar, or symphonic music, jazz music, rock music, and do the same analysis. So of course, music comes in an endless variety of forms, and there's no claim to kind of universality of structure like that. But if you take large corpora of different kinds of musics and musical styles, and you do the same analysis, you find that it's actually systematically lower. So starting up here in the upper right, here's the direct comparison. So the black line is the modulation spectrum of speech that I just told you about, which peaks between 4 and 5, right? So those are all the speech cases. And next to it is music, but now here putting together a bunch of different kinds of analyses. So for instance, single voice instruments, violin or cello, multi-voice instruments, multi-part music. And if you look at here in the panel E, you see the peak frequency, the modulation rate for music versus speech. So speech is between 4 and 5 hertz, and music is typically around 2 hertz, whether it has speech in it or not, which is here at the end. So that's pretty neat. So you have a modulation range for speech and you have a modulation range for music. You could ask yourself whether that actually has any meaning for musical performance or musical perception of any kind, and it clearly does. So if you ask people to do different musical tasks, just briefly, things like beat induction, melody recognition, optimal tonal induction, that means what key are you in? These are actually exactly within this rate that has around the mean of 2 hertz with a pretty narrow bound. So all the things that you want to do in music comprehension, like figure out what key it's in, recognize the melody, figure out what's the beat, happens roughly with that range 2 hertz, about 120 beats per minute, which is kind of cool. Okay, so intermediate conclusion. Music is faster than your heartbeat, but slower than your speech. So speech, I told you, and I'm going to tell you a bunch more times, is between 4 and 5 hertz until you remember it. Your heartbeat is, of course, on the order of 1 hertz, and music is on the order of 2 hertz. So there are sort of different regimes of timing that are going on in this thing. Now, you're a bunch of linguists, and what you really typically care about is the stuff in the box in the middle. So you say, well, look, you've been telling me about linear input sequences, like the speech signal coming in, or linearized output sequences, like the stuff coming out of my mouth. It could be sign, it could be text, it could be braille. But what I care about is the stuff that is the representational infrastructure, like the fact that there is hierarchical organization of phrases, there are dependencies, there are local and long distance relations, there are structure dependent relations. The way you build something up depends on the local parts and the compositional semantic operations. So all of this is, of course, what we slowly work to step by step. But that is not to demean the input and output relations. They turn out to be quite informative. So there is no claim about grammar here, but think about this. I just told you that the input stuff and the output stuff is extremely regular. So at the very least, that places some temporal bounds on what's going on in the big box. That doesn't mean there's a single time scale. There surely is not, and I have lots to say about this. But you can actually infer some interesting properties of the computational apparatus that has to do all the computations in the language system once you know that they're chunk sizes of a certain time. So there's like temporal Lego blocks that form the basis for all the computational steps you have to take. So think of this as, so and the one I'm talking about now is the one that builds chunks of approximately a syllable size, and you have to then move them around and you have to decode them, do lexical access, but it gives you kind of the time scale of computation that's necessary for the linguistic system more broadly. Okay, so let's turn, so much for the physical signal of speech, which is, and you should have learned at least one new factoid that you can blabber on about at a party. So what about the brain? I mean, what does the brain have to do with this? Well, let's turn to some recordings, not using the old school hand scanner, like this is Gall, who used to just felt the bumps on the head, which was not a good idea, although he had some good ideas called organology. But we use machines like magnetoencephalography on the right-hand side, or electrocorticography on the left-hand side, electroencephalography, so EEG, ECOG, or MEG, so many different kinds of approaches to record electrophysiological signals. So in real time, very fast things. Now, what happens when you record brain data using these kinds of machinery when people are just listening to speech? And one of the really important discoveries in the last 10, 15 years, sort of very heavily pushed and developed by two tremendous scholars, Huan Luo, who's now a professor in Beijing University, and Naiding, who's a professor in Zhejiang, but is about to be a professor in Beijing University. The discovery they made, or harnessed, the discovery they really developed very thoughtfully, is that the brain actually locks on to the envelope. You learned all this stuff about the envelope and the mean rate of the envelope. Now, when you stick somebody in a machine and you record the brain data, this is the green line here, it turns out that the brain data locks on or tracks, sometimes people use the word entrain, to the speech signal. So the speech signal is going up and down, which we just talked about, and the brain actually is locking on to this up and down very precisely, very faithfully. So this is, for instance, an example with MEG. You can do it with ECOG. And clever experiment some years ago that Ilana Zion-Golumbich and Charlie Schroeder did in this. This is just single trials of people listening to two speakers at the same time, and so the cocktail party thing. So here's two trials where they're listening to the female speaker. It looks pretty similar. This is a single trial. This is no fancy data processing. And here it is listening to the male speaker. So just by virtue of listening to a different envelope, you see that it's entraining to a different envelope, which is an exciting thing. And a lot of it was learned by a bunch of experiments by Keith Doling, a former PhD student, now a postdoc in Paris. The basic experiment, again, you have a speech waveform. There's the envelope. Now your brain entrains to the envelope, right? So here's a visualization of the stimulus envelope on the right, the brain data on the left, and you see this very tight tracking. And Keith, in some very elegant experiments building on studies with Oded Gitza from BU, showed that if you don't have this tracking, then you can't understand anything. So if you take away the ability of the brain to entrain or to track the speech signal, your intelligibility is gone. And when you reconstitute it with some nice tricks, you understand stuff again. So you really need to be able to lock onto this information. That's very critical. So the kind of first pass insight here is that, borrowing a nice slide that Keith made some years ago, is that what is going on here? Well, here's the one slide summary. Here's a sentence. She had your dark suit in greasy wash water all year. Very continuous, there's no breaks. And here's the spectrogram. So this is what it should look like in your brain. Now we look at the envelope. We record the brain data, and you see the brain data locks onto the envelope. And the consequence is that it pulls apart the data and inserts the white spaces where there were none. So you've now segmented the continuous stream into chunks that you can then input into decoding pathways to try to figure out what's the internal structure and how do I map to stored lexical items. Okay, so we now have kind of a cool alignment. So we have a linking hypothesis between, first we talked about the physics of speech, the modulation spectrum. Then we talked about the linguistic correlation that actually syllable duration turns out to match that very closely. And then we showed that the brain rhythms, so-called theta rhythms that go up and down, lock on or track the speech precisely. So we have now a kind of initial link how to go from from one kind of problem to another kind of problem. We can always make new problems. This is good. So physics told us there's a modulation of speech. Neurobiology told us that you entrain to that modulation. And linguistics tells us that when you get that out, you're dealing with syllable-sized chunks that you can now use for decoding. So we have a whole kind of soup to nuts story, at least from the beginning of the signal to some intermediate step. And if you're really an aficionado of this kind of research and you want to go into the nitty-gritty, here's a paper with Annelise Giraud from some years ago, summarizes the kind of physiological details. So going from a speech waveform at the input that generates neural activity, or here it's called stimulus-driven spike train. You can see it just keeps going. And what you want, conceptually speaking, is a spike train with little white spaces in between, right? So you now have made chunks that are good for decoding and for understanding the next pieces. Okay, so we have a whole story to go from a continuous signal that's really hard to, it has no breaks, it's hard to decode, it's hard to understand. So, but that's all very serious. So let's go to a slightly different thing, and for a more playful and fun aspect of this research, where you can now apply what's going on here. So I have to pull up some different slides for a second. Pardon me, and I'm going to share something different. Okay, here we go. So I want to now apply some of these ideas in the context of a very different kind of study. So this is a study that was run in the, by, oh, now I guess I don't have a, do I still have a mouse? Maybe not. It was run by Florencia Asaneo in the lower left, Joan Orpea in the middle, and Pablo Ripollez on the right. And it has to do with synchronizing speech. So now we're going to take some of the ideas you just heard about and put them together in kind of a funky and amusing way. Well, I think it's amusing, but you know, she's the kind of people I hang out with. So let's start with the simple concept of audio motor synchronization. So audio motor synchronization is something that happens all the time effortlessly. And let me give you this cheesy example from German television. Fantastic. Of course, only Germans, when there's fun music, would sit there straight and not move other than their hands. But that's, you know, but they did synchronize, right? So no shoulders, no hips, but they did synchronize. Okay. So it happens effortlessly. These are not all trained people. But you can even see this in other species. So here's a nice example from a vocal learner. So yeah, I mean, this is brought out often because it's fun. It is a fun example. But you have to imagine what has to be possible for this to happen, right? So if you have to actually build the machine that does this, it's actually not so trivial. So there's audio motor synchronization. You hear something, you move. Now, how does this actually happen in your own head? As we speak, we hear stuff, we hear others, we hear ourselves. So the question we're going to address in this very fun and peculiar experiment is, what about speech-to-speech synchronization by yourself? So let me show you a fun experiment designed by a bunch of people in the lab. Here's the experiment. It's extremely simple and extremely silly. So you're wearing headphones, as you can see in the upper left. I seem to have, in this interface, lost my mouse, so I can no longer point, but that's okay. It's all very straightforward. So in the upper row, you see you're wearing headphones and you're hearing a string of syllables. What rate do you think these syllables are played at? If you were paying attention and not hidden under a rock, it should be somewhere between 4 and 5 hertz, I hope. Right. So you're hearing a string of syllables like fu, ki, pe, la, di, da happening. And your task is exceptionally easy. You just have to, there's some target syllable, and at the end you have to say, did you hear it? So if the target was fu, then at the end of the second sequence, you just press either yes or no. Very simple task, nothing to it. But there's one little wrinkle, and the little wrinkle adds all the fun. Namely, the instruction is, while all this is happening, while you're listening, and you're listening for this syllable target, you have to whisper quietly the syllable ta. So you're going ta, 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 ta the whole time. And so you're listening to the syllables, waiting for the targets, and whispering ta, ta, ta. Very simple task, no instructions. You're just told to please whisper. Now something very peculiar happens, but peculiar, but cool. So there's, as always in life, two kinds of people. What kinds of people are there? There's one, so what do? We first of all are going to calculate, again, the envelope. You see in the upper row, the envelope of the input speech, fu, ki, pe. And in the lower panel, the envelope that you say. And we're now going to calculate how closely those are related using something called a phase locking value. Really just, we want to know how closely are they together in time. Okay, what happens is you get people, they're in the right side, in the kind of orange-red distribution, they cannot help but synchronize to the input. They go exactly like to the input syllable. When the syllable comes, they go ta, 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 ta. And then you get the free birds. The free birds just don't care. Those are the people in the blue distribution. They hear the syllable thing and they just go ta, 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 ta. So they don't feel compelled at all. So you have free birds and you have the compulsive synchronizers. And now that, when you see a distribution like that, everybody in the lab is skeptical. Say, that sounds like bullshit. That's probably just an accident. Can't be true. It's too weird. And who would do such a thing? So you have to do it many times. So the first clever thing these guys did is, let's do it again with the same people. Let's do it again an hour later. Let's do it again a month later. And when you do it again a little later, they're still the same people. So on the lower right, you see this phase locking value the first time, and then the phase locking value the second time, and you stay very stable. So it's a feature of you. You are either a compulsive synchronizer or you are a free bird. You just don't care. So, okay, interesting. That's a little bit of evidence. Can we gain more evidence? You can do all kinds of stuff. So we've done this experiment online, collecting way more people. So here's a mechanical Turk version of the experiment, where on the left side, again, you see the distribution into low synchronizers and high synchronizers. So at this point, you should be asking yourself, well, what am I? Am I high or low? And you think intuitions are misleading. You might think you're high or low, but this is a very peculiar experiment. So don't kid yourself. Okay, so you can do it online, that works. Does it work across languages and across other experimental scenarios? It does. You can keep getting this distribution back. So there really are high synchronizers and low synchronizers. And we've done this experiment many times now in many languages with many different variations. So it's really quite stable. One little wrinkled, very cool version that I rather like, it's kind of my favorite part of this, is what happens when you play people the syllable stream, right? So you're listening there, you got your headphones on, the syllable stream is coming, you're listening for your target, and you change just a little bit the rate. So just imperceptibly, you change it from this rate to slightly faster, slightly faster. You know, can you actually track that? This is an amazing finding, I think. You see the high synchronizers on the lower right, you see the red line in that graph is the slight change in pace from 4.3 to 4.7. And you see the high synchronizers really going step by step, following that, that progression. The low synchronizers stay all over the map and they don't care. So there really is an extremely high sensitivity to that, and the high sensitivity to then linking the audio motor output, which is just so cool and peculiar. Okay, so we have highs, we have lows. Now we want to know, because we are, cognitive neuroscientists in my lab, well, is there a neural correlate of this? And if there is, does it matter? Does it do anything exciting for us? So we did two different kinds of experiments. In one experiment, we used magnetoencephalography, right? We looked at that a little bit earlier. So that's electrophysiological activity of the brain. And in another one, we used structural imaging, diffusion weight imaging, and also tractography analysis. I'm just going to show one of those for your delectation. But let's look at one of these first. So the MEG protocol. So in this experiment, the victims, so-called normals, undergraduates typically, are lying on the machine. Again, listening now to the sequence of syllables, fu, ki, pe, la, di, do, and have to execute the task. Was the target syllable there? But you didn't have to say anything. There was no speaking, just passive listening to a stream of syllables and figuring out the target. Very easy. And we're recording the brain activity from the entire head with MEG, and then we're reconstructing where in the head is the activity distributed, and in particular, where's the difference between highs and lows? We now have highs and lows again, right? So we get a bunch from one group and a bunch from the other. Now, we look into the brain, we find different regions of interest. So at the bottom here, you see different regions of interest in the temporal lobe and the frontal lobe. And what we're going to calculate is, again, the envelope of the input, right? So that's that green line in the middle. You see it over, again, the envelope we've been talking about all along. So that's representative of the speech rate. And on the top, the red signal is actually the signal in the from whichever region of the brain you're interested in this case, from the speech motor cortex, or the front part of the brain, in the left frontal cortex. Now here, something quite cool happens again, namely, here's the left hemisphere of the human brain, and the left frontal lobe, that's not the auditory cortex. So that's the part of the motor cortex and the part of the head for planning speech. So in this particular case, high synchronizers, so if you're somebody who just likes to synchronize, conveys the signal to the speech motor cortex significantly more, despite there being no motor task. Right? So this is just a passive listening task. But if you're a high synchronizer, that link from audition to motor action is very tight and is reflected in activity, phase-locked activity in the front part of the brain, which is quite surprising. Well, you say, all right, that's one piece of evidence. We have, unsurprisingly, many pieces of evidence. What about some kind of structural data? So let's take 20 highs and 20 lows and look at their brain structure. Are there any systematic differences that we have to account for here? And let me show you here how that looks. So here is a very elegant tractographic analysis that the team did for highs versus lows. So at the bottom, you see, again, you split the population with your very simple ta-ta-ta task, the ta-ta task, and then you reconstruct their brain, in particular here, the arcuate fasciculates, right? So this is a tract of fibers connecting different parts of the brain, in this case, parts of the temporal lobe, the parietal lobe to the frontal lobe. And you can see on the right side, those are the high synchronizers. This is an individual example, are very juicy, a big, fibery, thick, juicy tract of meat through the brain. The left side is also very nice, but perhaps a little bit more modest. The spaghettis are a little fewer and a little thinner. So there's a difference in the tract organization in the highs versus low that connect the auditory parts of the brain to the frontal parts of the brain. And if you look at that more systematically and quantitatively, it's not just that any part of the brain is different, it's really that particular set of tracts. So if you look at other tracts, which are reflected in the upper right graphs, for instance, something called the ILF and the IFOF, these are different tracts in the brain. They're not difference between high and lows. They're just part of the structure of your head anatomically. But the arcuate fasciculus is really quite different when you look at its volume. So now we have, as a summary, in this very quirky experiment, remember, what did we start with? We started with people whispering ta, 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 while they were listening to syllables. We showed that there's a very clear behavioral difference. There's a kind of remarkable physiological difference, and there's some structural differences. So overall, there's evidence between these highs and lows for a real audio motor network that's quite distinct in these kind of populations. So I might say, well, that's nice and good, and it's kind of cool that you can find something by just whispering ta 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 for 2 minutes. This, by the way, this task goes very fast. You don't have to be in the lab for an hour. This task takes 1 to 2 minutes effectively. So does this actually have any consequences? We started with aspects of speech. Now we did aspects of brain. So let's go back to some classical tasks that you have to do. And I picked one that I think is particularly interesting from a broader view. It is, let's take a look at the famous task of statistical word learning. That's a task that's used all the time in psycholinguistics and in general in cognitive psychology. The task was originally Dick Aslin and Jenny Safran and Lissa Newport had the original papers on this. And the idea is you have a stream of syllables. They're unstructured, non-words. but you structure the syllables so that some of them go together as basically pseudo words. So so for instance, take de mori, which is the blue one there. So you hear, what you're hearing auditorily is raku, so, de, mori, fi, le, ru, se, and so on. But the de mori repeats every now and then, and the fi, le, ru repeats every now and then. But you're not doing anything. So this is statistical word learning. Now, it's been shown to work quite well in infants, in all kinds of different individual modality, in the auditory modality, for many different kinds of design. So it's a very robust thing. So it's something you want to be good at. And why did we choose this? Because of course here, word learning is a particularly interesting thing. In word learning, you have to get a new sound stream that you have to link to pronunciation, and you don't have meaning yet in this case. So you just get some auditory input, and you need to build a representation that has statistical regularity that you can also say. And when you do this statistical word learning, and you plug in, so for instance, you want to find these words in the sequence, real words versus non-words, the high synchronizers, again, you bring in a new batch of victims, you find your highs, you find your lows, and the ones that are high actually are robustly better than lows at statistical word learning. So that's kind of, so if you're somebody who, when they hear a bunch of speech, start synchronizing like a maniac, ta, 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 you are also someone who's likely to be good at statistical word learning. Now, that doesn't make you a better person. That just makes you a compulsive synchronizer, just to be clear. Who knows what else this is correlated with, but it's fascinating that a very simple property of speech, like its syllabic rate, insofar as you synchronize it to it, becomes indicative of certain more broad cognitive functions like word learning. Okay, so that brings me to the end of this exercise on speech things. So what are you supposed to remember or allowed to remember? So first of all, we started with the modulation rate of speech. The modulation rate is between 4 and 5 hertz. You may not want to believe that, but you can take that to the bank. This is in the famous line of, I think it was Tip O'Neill or someone, you can have you're entitled to your own opinions, but not your own facts. This is just an observation about the world, and you have to deal with it somehow. And I'm very committed that that actually is on the right track. Then we talked about a simple task, the ta-ta-ta task. And that turns out to be, it's very fun and playful and easy, but it turns out to show differences in your behavior, in your physiology, in your anatomy. And it has interesting consequences for a lot of things, including word learning, but also, as some current experiments are showing, it has to do with how much you entrain to yourself. So do you actually entrain to your own speech? If you speak at a certain rate, are you actually expecting speech at your own rate? So some very nice new experiments from the lab are providing new evidence. Now, I showed you in the brain data that there's a relationship between auditory cortex and motor cortex. And it's pretty clear for everyone that this connection between hearing and speaking is very critical at the initial learning phase, right? Because you have to map what you say. So your motor output has to be mapped to the correct acoustic targets. You have to tune the audio motor connections. That's for sure true in infants, certainly true when you learn new words. So it's a system that can be harnessed during learning in adults. So this connection between the hearing system and the speaking system is absolutely critically necessary for learning language, or learning certainly the items of your language, learning the phonetic repertoire and how it builds words. But it can also be harnessed for all other kinds of learning in the linguistic domain. So what I walk away with is the conclusion that I'm not in favor here of a motor theory of speech perception. The most famous theory, but I also think the incorrect theory. What is, I think, supported by these kind of experiments is the sensory motor theory of learning. As you don't need the motor cortex to understand speech, but you absolutely need it to learn stuff or under other circumstances. So this is for the sensory motor theory of learning. I hope you remember a few of these factoids and that some of them are interesting and at least puzzling. if you're interested in this literature more broadly, there's a brand new review article that summarizes a lot of this and gives some more integrative perspective with Florencia. She is now a professor in Mexico, starting this very moment, and a member of the lab at NYU. And this is a nice paper I think it came out about a month ago or so. If you were able to pay attention, thank you. If you had a cocktail, good for you. And I'm happy, insofar as there are any questions, to answer any of them. Thank you very much.
Okay, can you hear me? Can you see me?
I can hear you. I can not see you.
Miguel, can people hear me? Just wait for Miguel to give
Yes, it's
feedback.
working
Yes?
fine. Go ahead.
Okay. So, David, thank you for a wonderful talk. It was really delightful. It's really amazing the quality and quantity and the amount of data that your lab has been publishing. And it's very nice, very kind of you to share this knowledge with us. And we're very thankful.
Very happy to do it.
There have been a couple of questions. I selected some questions here to ask you.
Mm-hmm.
So the first one, well, there are two questions here which are connected. So does the processing of speech in the brain happens purely on the level of syllables? What would be the role of prosody in that sense? Mm-hmm. And the second question, which I think is connected, is, do you believe that larger chunks of information in speech are processed differently, say words, discursive units, sentences?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good question. I mean, very, very reasonable. So yeah, surely there's many time scales and there's not. So in fact, how about I show you a picture for that? Would that be helpful? I think that might be the easiest. So let me share my screen again. So we're going to do a bit of back and forth screen sharing. So let me share my screen to show you more concretely, because I have an example of precisely that. Wait, I have to find a slide and then I can show it to you, because it's a good question. So of course, many things happen on many different timescales. And if I could find the timescale, then I would be delighted to show it to you. Ah, here we go. I found it. Now I have to share my screen again, right?
Mm-hmm.
There we go. Okay. So here you see a bunch of arrows, right? And just to get a broader sort of broader situation here is, when you think of the time structure of process, anything, you know, in any domain, we typically think of this kind of Newtonian thing, like the arrow on top, right? So it's just a continuous thing like that. And that accords very well with our intuition. Our intuition is that there's an arrow of time like that. But really, our brain, as I just told you too, chunks things up into little chunks. And in particular, I made an argument for this kind of syllable size chunking, which is absolutely, as far as we can tell, really necessary. But it's a good point, a good question. It's certainly not sufficient, in the sense that there are many other time scales dealing with different kinds of phenomena. So for starters, there's of course, inside the syllables, there's featural and phonetic information that happens much faster. So if you look one level below here, right, so there's, you have these red arrows, and let's think of those roughly as a syllable size chunk. But of course, then you have finer grained things going on. Then you have to granulate the input finer to get featural and phonetic information out. And that's actually this, this information just above it. So likewise, when you go above that, there are larger units of prosody that are associated with larger chunks. So there's very much what's a kind of multi-time resolution processing. What we're trying to figure out is, what are these units? What are sort of the temporal primitives which you use for making the chunks? And today I only talked about the one that deals with making roughly syllable size units, right? So like the red ones, but there are both faster ones for which we have a ton of evidence, and there's actually slower ones, which we're currently investigating, which are a little bit more tricky to work with. And then when you go to the level of discourse, of course, you're dealing with different things. Now, is the processing always the same? Well, no, not really, because you're dealing with different representational units. So you're once you're dealing, let's say, with let's say grammatical information, all kinds of, or other, lexical information. You have, of course, the input wave of the signal, but you have top-down information, contributing, predicting, resetting the phase of oscillation. So there's this very complicated, rich info. I mean, understanding even a single word is really complicated. It's really, it's kind of a mess. And so you have to do many different things at many different scales concurrently to solve this. And what we're, the kind of game to play is to figure out, well, what are they? What are the different things and how can we get to them? So can I move this around here just to give you a, yeah, I mean, this is, so for many years, I've worked with my colleague, Greg Hickok, on this model of how you actually recognize a word or two. And this is so-called dual stream model. And you see, look how many different things have to happen just to say boring lecture. And so there's a ton of stuff you have to do from the input, right? So you have to do some analysis here. You have to turn it into phonological things. You have to map it to words. They have to connect to concepts. Your phonological code has to connect to output systems. It has to be in a different format. So not just is it on multiple time scales, it's in multiple regions. So this is an exceptionally complicated problem. And so what we're trying to figure out in this kind of research is what are the elementary building blocks or the primitives. And we try to steal ideas from neuroscience on the one hand, like the idea of oscillations, and then from linguistics, right? So from linguistics, we have really good reason to believe something like distinctive feature is deeply important, or morpheme, or syllable, or intonation contour, or noun phrase. And so we have to borrow the different things and then try to find the alignments. And it's a quite difficult problem because these are both difficult domains and they're kind of different in terms of stuff. So finding what the links are is sort of the special challenge. There's definitely multiple timescales involved.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry for the very short answer.
Oh, it was perfect.
Yeah.
There's another question here. It's a different question. So a bunch of other species have their ability of motor rhythmic synchronization, which happens to be vocal learners as well.
That's right, yeah.
And then here's the question. Might this be an evolutionary precursor of complex forms of vocal communication? What do you think about this?
Yeah, a good point. I mean, it's certainly an evolutionary precursor to audio motor alignment and processing. Whether the extent to what that influences communication is a slightly different and complicated issue. And I'm not really prepared to adjudicate that, frankly. I mean, communication is yet another, between species is obviously difficult. It's different from language, the way it's different from human language. So animal communication systems are not the same kind of system, although they clearly borrow from each other. So whether audiomotor learning and audiomotor alignment facilitate that, one would imagine yes. But why that would be and how that would work is I think a question for further research, and I just don't know. But I think it's a good broader point.
Right. And then I think I'm going to finish with this question, which is a more philosophical question. And I know you're into the philosophy of neuroscience as well, right? So there's this famous sentence that you repeated a couple of times, which is anatomy is destiny, like quoting Freud, but not explanation. So I think you are referring to the mapping problem, right? And to the fact that we know a lot about localization in the brain, and we know very little about function. And then I was thinking about this kind of research we do about reading disabilities, and sometimes, and we have been finding more and more the role of, for example, white matter and inter-hemisphere connectivity in how it explains the disability. So putting all this together, I'd like to hear you on this a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, these are, yeah, thank you for the extremely difficult question that I can't answer. I appreciate it. I think our job is made easier by studying problems which we define very carefully at the level of behavior first. And so the brain's a complicated place, really complicated place. And if we start, I in fact have a paper about to come out about this very issue. It's called Against Implementation or something like that. Against implementation first. And the issue is that you will always find something in the brain. And the question is, how do you go from just observations there to complicate function? Now, if on the other hand, we have a very careful description of whether it's, whether it's in normal or normal language processing, or in changes in reading disability, in late, any configuration, an extremely careful characterization of that allows us at least to figure out what to look for. And the what to look for can take two forms. One is simply the kind of functional anatomy problem, is where in the head is what distributed, which is a really, it's kind of like the homework you have to do. Where is the stuff that I'm actually looking for? But that doesn't get you, that gets you to only where to look. Now the fun begins. You have to say, well, what is actually the, how do you now align in some area the wiring diagram, the anatomy, the physiology, whatever is carried computationally, to the carefully characterized behavioral thing I have. Let's say it's, reading disability on the theory that you don't have a robust phonological representation. Then you need to break that down. So my own self-description is as a radical decompositionalist, right? So I favor non-holistic approaches to this, right? So you look at the thing, you say, okay, what are the elementary Lego blocks that form the basis for the phenomenon, let's say reading disability, and then you use those as the kind of guiding principle to figure out, well, what kind of neural correlates are there that could have a systematic relation? Now you're still in the domain of just describing stuff. You're describing behavioral stuff, you're describing neural stuff. Then a much more difficult problem is to try to then discern or to figure out what would it mean to explain the higher order thing on the basis of these more, let's say, neural wetware terms. That's an extraordinarily difficult task in all of neuroscience. It has nothing to do with speech, with language, with cognition. And once you go away from hardware implementation, things get extremely complicated because we have very few examples to figure out what algorithms are there, what kind of problems do they solve. So my own principle or sort of guiding hypothesis is that an extremely pedantic, organized, methodical analysis of the perceptual or cognitive or behavioral thing should be the prerequisite to doing the brain research thing. So first do the linguistics and then do the brain research, and be open-minded in both cases because you're both wrong.
Fantastic. And this is nice because on your website, on your lab website, you define yourselves as methodological pluralists.
Yes.
Which is really interesting. Yes. And it's nice that you called attention to the importance of behavioral studies, because we have this neurophilia, right, era. So we've been all looking for fancy methodological implementations. And if we live in Brazil, we don't have that many resources to conduct research using expensive methods. So it's really nice. I think it's a very nice closing remark for our students and researchers who've been listening to us and who are worried about like designing their experiments, the importance of conducting behavioral research as well. Thank you very much.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, David. And just to finish, people, I'd like to thank you for being here, for asking questions. And if you'd like to write a review of this talk and submit it to be published in the Abralin, Revista da Abralin, you are more than welcome to do that. And please follow our social networks, follow Abralin there, because there will be lots of nice talks coming up and you have to keep up with us, okay? Good evening. Thank you, David.
Thank you.